In the movie Transformers 1, Sentinel Prime's actions stand as a paradox. Though he is neither a hero nor an anti-hero, his decision to betray the Primes and align with the Quintesson invaders ultimately safeguarded Cybertron from annihilation. Sentinel's motivations were driven by selfish desires for power and control, yet the consequences of his betrayal had an unintended, though significant benefit for the survival of the Cybertronian race. Through his alliance with the Quintessons, Sentinel Prime made the difficult choice to protect the planet and its inhabitants from a greater existential threat, despite the moral and ethical costs of his actions. At the core of Sentinel Prime's decision was the larger war between the 13 Primes and the Quintessons, a conflict that had pushed the Cybertronian civilization to the brink of collapse. The Primes were the leaders of Cybertron and the guardians of its future. However, by the time Sentinel Prime rose to power, the Primes were in a losing war against the Quintessons, a race of malevolent aliens with a ruthless agenda. The Quintessons, having invaded Cybertron and begun their campaign of exploitation and destruction, had the upper hand in the war. Despite their powers and the strength of their armies, the Primes were fighting a losing war. The consequences of this war were dire. The Primes' resistance was slowly being crushed, and their defeat would have meant the obliteration of Cybertron itself. It is within this context that Sentinel Prime's betrayal takes on a different meaning. Though his personal motivations were selfish, his actions, in a way, protected the planet. Sentinel Prime's betrayal of the Primes was not a decision made out of malice toward his fellow Cybertronians, but rather out of a desire for survival and power. Desperate to save himself and maintain control over Cybertron, Sentinel made a deal with the Quintessons. In exchange for their support, he would serve them, allowing them to exploit Cybertron's energon resources and ensuring his own rule over the planet. The Primes, who had stood in opposition to the Quintessons, were betrayed by their own servant, who sought a more pragmatic path, one that ensured the survival of Cybertron, with him as their king. While Sentinel's motivations were deeply self-serving, it is important to recognize that his alliance with the Quintessons effectively halted the complete destruction of Cybertron. The Primes, in their resistance to the Quintessons, had been driving the planet toward total ruin. Their war was draining the planet's resources and inflicting untold suffering on the population. Sentinel's decision to align with the Quintessons temporarily halted the immediate destruction of Cybertron, though at the cost of Cybertron's freedom. As a result of Sentinel Prime's betrayal, the Cybertronian race was forced into a new status quo, one where the miners, stripped of their transformation cogs and relegated to servitude, were forced to toil under the oppressive regime of Sentinel and the Quintessons. These miners, including characters like Orion Pax, were not free, but they were alive. Their lives were harsh, their work grueling, and their futures uncertain. Yet, the alternative, an unmitigated war with the Quintessons, would have resulted in their extinction. By enslaving his own people, Sentinel preserved their lives, even if they were subjected to a form of suffering and subjugation. This stark reality underscores the complexity of Sentinel Prime's actions. Though he betrayed the ideals of the Primes and subjected the population of Cybertron to a life of oppression, his decision ensured that the Cybertronian species survived. The miners, though stripped of their dignity and freedom, lived to see another day, and this was in large part due to Sentinel's choice to side with the Quintessons rather than allow the Primes to continue their doomed war. Sentinel Prime's betrayal ultimately resulted in a paradoxical form of protection for Cybertron. The planet itself was preserved, its cities and inhabitants spared from immediate destruction by the Quintessons. While Sentinel's actions were driven by personal ambition and a desire to maintain power, the consequences of his alliance with the Quintessons were far-reaching. The planet and its inhabitants were not destroyed, and Cybertron's survival allowed for the eventual emergence of a new generation of leaders, such as Optimus Prime, who would fight for a freer and more just future. Moreover, Sentinel's actions helped create the conditions for a rebellion. It was only because Cybertron's miners were kept alive, despite their subjugation, that they were able to eventually rise against their oppressors. Sentinel's regime, built on exploitation and betrayal, set the stage for the emergence of heroes like Orion Pax, whose eventual rise to become Optimus Prime would bring about the downfall of both the Quintessons and Sentinel's corrupt reign. In the end, Sentinel Prime's legacy is one of tragic irony. Though he betrayed the very ideals of the Primes and allied with the Quintessons for selfish reasons, he inadvertently protected Cybertron from total destruction. His actions, though deeply flawed, ensured the survival of the Cybertronian race and preserved the possibility of future resistance. The miners may have been enslaved and stripped of their transformation cogs, but they were alive, and that, in the grand scheme of Cybertron's survival, was a victory of sorts. Sentinel Prime was not a hero, nor was he an anti-hero. He was a man who made a devastating choice in the face of an existential threat. In the end, he was the reluctant protector of Cybertron, whose betrayal allowed the planet to endure long enough for its true saviors to emerge. His actions highlight the complexities of leadership, sacrifice, and survival, where sometimes the most morally questionable choices may lead to the preservation of life itself.